Okay. So last time we started on the hepatic portal system. Well, we ended on it, I think. But you all were not here, so I don't know if you even got any of what I was talking about. Y'all kind of zoned out on me. Did anybody get anything from that, the hepatic portal system? So we're talking about blood vessels, right? And knowing the difference between arteries and veins, and the relationship between arteries and veins and capillaries. So the capillaries, what is the important thing about capillaries? Okay. So the way I visualize it is you have arteries sending blood through capillaries, and then you have veins carrying blood away from the capillaries. So if I have something like a picture showing you those things, you should be able to tell me what is going on in the arteries, right? First of all, what direction is the blood flowing? And that's going to be toward the what? Capillaries. And once that blood reaches the capillaries, what's happening there in the capillaries? Okay, so if this is the capillary area, what's happening when blood gets into the capillaries? So what's so special about the capillaries? Gas exchange. What does that mean? But what about oxygen? Unloaded from where to where? That's kind of what I'm getting at. So again, as blood goes from the arteries, arterioles, into the capillaries, what is happening there? So just think of the capillaries as like a train station where the train stops. Right? I think I used that analogy. So as blood goes through the capillary, something happens that's so important. You all are saying it, but I want to make sure you really understand what you're telling me. So you're saying gas exchange. I'm just wondering if you really know what that means.
Oxygen is going into it, and CO2 is coming out.
Okay. Okay. So oxygen is doing what?
Going into the tissue cells of capillary. It's changing, and then the CO2 is coming out.
Right, but I want you all to see it. Are y'all here? I don't think so. I really don't. Y'all are kind of hesitant to answer. So you know gas exchange, but again, it's not important just to know gas exchange, but what that actually means. So if you have, let's just say this is an arteriole, it's going to send blood through capillaries. And then when the blood leaves the capillaries, it enters what? Veins, right? And then the blood goes where? Right, to the heart. What side of the heart?
The right, the front back.
There you go. All right, y'all, come on. No white chalk. Well, what I was wanting to show, we just do it here. So as blood flows in this direction, again, arterioles. So blood in the arterioles is what? O2 rich. Okay, so the O2 rich blood is there in the arteries and arterioles. And where did the oxygen come from? The lungs. The lungs sent the oxygen into the blood. Now that blood is being sent all over the body. Now let's just say this is a capillary bed, and that capillary bed is serving the tissue of my big toe. Big toe tissue. So my left big toe, again, it would fall off if it didn't get what? So if the cells of my big toe didn't get oxygen and nutrients, I wouldn't have a big toe very long. So as the blood flows through the capillaries, what's so important about the capillaries is what? My big toe cells are all around these capillaries. Okay? So all those cells of my big toe need what? So they need oxygen. What else? And glucose in order to make ATP. Good. So as blood flows through the capillaries, the blood is flowing through here, oxygen diffuses out into the tissues. Okay, and eventually diffuses into the cells. Whereas CO2, remember where CO2 comes from? So here's the tissue cells, and they're surrounded by capillaries. Those capillaries are carrying oxygen-rich blood. That oxygen, as the blood flows through the capillary, diffuses out of the bloodstream, right? Out of the capillary bed into the surrounding tissue, and then enters the cells. So where does CO2 come from? So we're talking about gas exchange. So that must mean O2 is exchanged for CO2. So CO2 must come from the tissue cells. So remember, each of these cells has to be able to make ATP. Make ATP from oxygen plus glucose. Okay? So in order to make ATP, the cell needs oxygen and glucose, but in that process of making ATP, what else is made? CO2. There you go. So ATP is made, but CO2 is also made. The cell has to get rid of the CO2 that is made. So all these cells are releasing CO2 into the tissue fluid, the extracellular space, and that CO2 diffuses into the capillary. Okay? The capillary, the blood within the capillary. So the key point that I was trying to get to is it is at the capillaries that substances move in and out of the bloodstream. When you're at the arteries and arterioles, there is no diffusion of anything outside here. Why? Last time we mentioned that. Why can't oxygen diffuse out of the arteries and arterioles? Exactly, because of the tunics, the layers of the blood vessel, the walls. Remember the outer, middle, and inner layers? So there are too many layers there. In the capillaries, why is it so easy for oxygen and CO2 to diffuse? Right, because there's only one layer of cells, so those gases just easily diffuse across the membrane of the capillaries. Okay? So, as blood leaves the capillaries, the gas changes, right? The predominant gas changes. So, coming in, remember, there was more what? Oxygen, but now the oxygen has been delivered to the tissue, and now also the tissue has sent CO2 into the blood. So as blood leaves the capillaries, it is going to be CO2 rich, and therefore in veins, most of the time your systemic veins, the color is usually shown as blue, this meaning low oxygen. Okay, so for the picture here, we're looking at the capillary of my big toe. We have those all over the body, right? Because all cells of the body have to be able to get that same oxygen. What happens to the blood when it leaves the capillaries of my big toe and most other tissues? Where does that blood go? So you come into the venous side, the tiny veins, the venules, the veins, vena cava, but then where? Right, so to the right side of the heart, and remember the right side of the heart pumps it to the lungs to get rid of the CO2 that was picked up here. Okay, so it all has a purpose. So you can kind of think of the lung capillaries is picking up the oxygen, delivering that oxygen to the tissues, and then the tissues send CO2 to the lungs to get rid of. So it's a cycle. Okay, so those are the two places where you have the gas exchange, in the lung capillaries and then the capillaries of all the other body tissues. Okay, so most of the time when you have blood leaving a capillary, that blood goes on to the heart and then to the lungs so that CO2 can be released. But in a hepatic portal system, and so we have hepatic meaning what? Whenever you see that word hepatic, liver. Okay, so a portal system here is just referring to the fact that some blood goes through two capillary networks. So by analogy, in this picture, since this is the tissue of my big toe, this blood will go directly to the heart, the right side of the heart. But when you have a portal system, that blood goes through another capillary network. And again, remember the importance of the capillaries. So in terms of the circulatory system, the capillaries are the only place where what happens? Exchange of material. Okay, nowhere else in the circulatory system can things come in and out of blood. Think about that. So anything in the blood is going to stay in the blood until that blood comes to a capillary network, because only the capillaries have that one layer where the molecules can diffuse. And we're not just talking about CO2 and oxygen. What else has to go across the capillary? Nutrients, right? Hormones. Okay? So keep that in mind. So here, the hepatic portal system, all of the digestive tissues, once they get the oxygen here and dump off CO2, that blood does not go directly back to the heart. It first goes through the liver. Okay, so that's all we're talking about here. So as the blood is picked up, or the oxygen is picked up, other materials, molecules are picked up as well by the blood coming from the small intestine, the large intestine, the pancreas, the spleen, the stomach. So all of those organs send blood through another capillary network. And you can probably guess why. You know, one of the functions of the liver is to detoxify the blood by breaking down any molecules that may be considered harmful to the body, instead of sending it through the circulation. And keep in mind, think about how blood gets to the other vital organs. Well, once it leaves the capillaries, it goes straight to the heart and then all the other organs. So if there's something poisonous in the stomach, intestines, you don't want that to pass on to all of the other vital organs. So it goes first through a checkpoint, you can kind of think of it as, to make sure the substances being passed through are okay. Also, we said the liver stores vitamins. Perhaps all the vitamins that are in your digestive system are not needed right away. So some of it is stored there. What else have we said is stored in the liver? Yes. So if you eat 6 Krispy Kreme donuts, does that sound reasonable? Yep. So once those Krispy Kreme donuts are broken down in your stomach and in your intestines, those glucose molecules are picked up through the what? Capillaries. Okay? So the stomach delivers those nutrients directly into the bloodstream through capillaries. Again, nothing enters or exits the blood except through capillaries. And every tissue has capillaries. So as those nutrients move into the bloodstream, we'll see next week that not all carbohydrates break down to just glucose. Some of them break down to fructose. You all heard of fructose? And galactose. So all of those are sent into the bloodstream, but the liver converts fructose and galactose into glucose. So you never hear about, when you hear about blood sugar, it's always what? Blood glucose, because the liver will convert the other types of carbohydrates to glucose. And if blood glucose levels are high, then there's no reason for the pancreas to release them into the bloodstream, so it does what? Stores them, packs them together, forming what? Glycogen, right. So the liver stores those excess glucose molecules in the form of glycogen. Okay? So that is the hepatic portal system. Tissue fluids. So blood exchanges oxygen, carbon dioxide, and other substances that are generated by cells. Tissue fluid, also called interstitial fluid, is the exchange medium. What does that mean? So if you look at this picture, you've all heard of interstitial fluid? You need to know what that is. That's just the fluid around the tissue cells. Okay? Interstitial tissue fluid is just the fluid here that the cells are, the tissues, the cells of the tissues are in. Okay? So the contents of the interstitial fluid and the blood is exchanged as well. So quite a bit of the plasma or the fluid of blood leaks out into the interstitial tissues. It becomes the fluid there. And we'll see that more in the next chapter, chapter 22. So here's a picture showing you the capillaries here and then the cells. So you can just visualize that exchange of gas taking place there. Okay, so these, on the picture you should be able to make out where the tissue cells are that are picking up oxygen and dumping off CO2. And these two are showing you here, so this is interstitial fluid. You have the blood capillary here. So another thing you should understand is, what is it that makes oxygen? So when we say gas exchange, we're talking about oxygen and CO2 being exchanged. Oxygen going to the tissues, CO2 going to the bloodstream. Why isn't it the reverse? Exactly. So that word diffusion. So all of this works by diffusion. If for some reason there's a higher concentration of oxygen in the tissue, then oxygen is not going to come out of the blood into the tissue. Okay, so the driving force, you all should know, for just about any type of activity in the body, is usually going to be diffusion. Okay, so oxygen and CO2 diffuse down their concentration gradient. Okay. And in 22, we'll talk about the lymphatic system, the lymph vessels, but it's important to know the relationship between the lymph vessels and the blood capillaries. So the capillaries are microscopic blood vessels, so they're too small to see. Remember, the size of a capillary, the diameter, is so small that only one red blood cell can pass through the capillary at one time. Okay, so they're very small. The walls are thin, so you have the endothelium, which is the layer there, one cell thick, and there are cells called pericytes that help stabilize the walls and control permeability to some degree. So capillaries are found in all tissues except for cartilage, epithelia, and the cornea and the lens. And you all may remember hearing in Biology 201, in AMP1, that cartilage is avascular and epithelial tissue is avascular. Do I remember that? So by avascular, what does that mean? Right, no blood vessels. So there's no direct connection to the nutrient source. So you may hear that cartilage heals slower. That's because it's avascular, which really means it has no capillaries. So it has to rely on the oxygen coming from capillaries of other tissues nearby. Epithelia, for example, epithelial tissue, give me an example. Skin. So skin is epithelium, right? And what do you all remember about the layers of the skin? You have 2 layers, right? So you have the epidermis, which is the outer, and the dermis. So are both of those avascular? Only the epidermis is avascular. The dermis is vascular. So the epidermis gets its oxygen and glucose from the capillaries of the dermis. They just diffuse on up to the epidermis. But the reason skin dies, exfoliates, is because, remember, there are several layers of epithelial tissue on the skin, and the further the cells get away from the nutrient source, they start to what? Die. So that's why the outer layer of skin that we have is pretty much dead skin cells. They're too far away from the nutrients of the what? Dermis. Okay, and it should be obvious why the cornea and lens don't have blood vessels. Because when we look around the room, we have a lot of lines in the way, right? Blood vessels, we see our own blood vessels. So whoever built this thing knew what they were doing. I know y'all get tired of hearing that, don't you? All right, my capillaries. So there are 3 types of capillaries. You all should know about the 3. Continuous, fenestrated, and sinusoidal. So the continuous capillaries have tight junctions. And basically, when you think about the 3 types, what you should be thinking about is which ones are more permeable than the other. Okay, so which are most permeable? What do I mean by that? You all remember permeability? Yeah. So permeability is the degree to which substances can cross the capillary wall and either exit the capillary or enter the capillary. But most of the time, exiting is what we're considering. So since continuous capillaries have tight junctions, that should tell you their permeability is probably what? Lower than the other 2. And that is correct. I think we've talked before about the blood-brain barrier, that substances within the blood have a difficult time coming into the brain tissue, and that is because of the tight junctions. So continuous capillaries are, for example, found in the brain, contributing to that blood-brain barrier. So you can see here, these are the least permeable types of capillaries, and most common because of the skin. Okay, and then parasites, you can see these little cells on the outside of the capillary wall, and they help to decrease the permeability of the capillaries. And then we have fenestrated capillaries, and these are more permeable than continuous capillaries. And they're going to be important then in areas where you have to have more permeability or more substances moving into and or out of the capillary, such as small intestine, endocrine glands, and kidneys. So you can see in the picture, it looks like the capillary wall has pores. So those are the fenestrations, and they increase the permeability, and that should be obvious, right? So you have pores, more things are going to be allowed to come in and out of the capillary. And again, these are going to be found in tissues such as the kidneys and small intestines, where more molecules or larger molecules have to cross. Let's see if you all can think about that for a moment. These you should be able to. So our glands, why would we not want our glands to have continuous capillaries? Because glands do what? Secrete chemicals, right? And those chemicals probably wouldn't be able to get into the bloodstream. So the glands have instead fenestrated capillaries so that when they do release their secretion, it goes, such as hormones, that those hormones go directly into the what? The bloodstream, from the glands into the bloodstream. Okay? The kidneys, small intestines. What about small intestines? What do you think is happening there that will require the capillaries to be fenestrated instead of continuous? What's happening there? So the small intestines, which we'll talk about next time, are breaking down the nutrients and sending products where? So the foods that you eat, why are you eating? Why are you eating a Big Mac? Because you're hungry? So why are you hungry? Because your body, your cells need food, glucose. Okay, so the foods you consume are broken down in the digestive system to a form that can be sent into the bloodstream and then be delivered to all the body cells. So the small intestine is one area where those nutrients leave the digestive system and then go into the circulatory system, into the blood. So in order for that to happen, those capillaries of the small intestine have to have large enough pores for glucose, for example, to get into the blood from the small intestine. Okay. And then there are sinusoidal, which are the most permeable type of capillary. Okay? So why would we need larger pores? And let's just see what that looks like. Those are really large pores. So these are sinusoidal capillaries. So what you can think about is what parts of the body have to exchange large molecules or even cells into the bloodstream. And they are the liver, bone marrow. You all know about bone marrow. What about it? So bone marrow produces cells, right? Red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets. So when the bone marrow makes those, they don't just stay in the bone marrow, do they? Where do they go? So from the bone marrow, those cells that are made there are sent into the bloodstream. Y'all with me? So how is it that cells go from the bone marrow into the bloodstream? Just like anything else. Anything coming into the bloodstream is coming in through capillaries. So your bone marrow has capillaries that have these large pores because they have to send cells. Cells are large compared to a molecule of glucose, right, or oxygen. So they have to have larger spaces in order for that to happen. Okay, and also the liver and spleen. The spleen also is an area, I think we talked before about the spleen breaking down red blood cells when they get old. So those red blood cells then are leaving the bloodstream and going into the tissue of the spleen. So that means the spleen has to have large enough spaces for those cells to come into the spleen from the bloodstream. Okay. We also talked somewhat before about how blood is shunted from some areas and sent to areas where blood is mostly needed under certain circumstances, such as if you're running from a madman with a knife, it's more important for your muscles, right, to get plenty of oxygen and glucose so you can continue running. More important than blood of your skin. So this is just showing you that sometimes there are situations where the capillary beds are not receiving blood at that time. Okay? And that's because there are precapillary sphincters which can open and close, open to allow blood to perfuse through, as we see in the top picture. So blood is going through, and then at the bottom, you see that there is no blood flowing through the capillary bed. So in that short period, the tissues are not getting any exchange. Okay. Capillary exchange. So how is it that substances move between the tissues and the blood within the capillaries? The main process is, what did we say? Diffusion. So substances are going to move from an area of high concentration to low concentration. And then you have blood pressure. What is that? Right. So the blood pressure is the force that blood exerts against its container, the blood vessels, and the wall of the heart. So pressure, if you're, let's just imagine you're on this side here, and you have something you can squeeze to push blood through. When you squeeze it, that's increasing the pressure in the vessels. Okay, so you can imagine then, if you squeeze here, blood goes through here, and what happens at the capillaries? The capillaries have openings. So some of what's being squeezed through the capillaries can what? Leak out. Okay, so some of the fluid, the plasma of blood, leaks out of the capillaries, even more so if pressure is high, if your blood pressure is high. Okay, so you may even see that in some people where they have swelling in certain tissues. So that's blood pressure. So diffusion is one thing that moves materials, blood pressure is another, and there are other contents within the blood that can be forced out as well. Some of the proteins that we talked about that are in plasma. Then there's osmotic pressure, which moves materials from the body tissues back into the capillaries. Okay, it's called osmotic pressure. So how does blood get back to the heart? That's what this is referring to. I'll let you all go through these, but we have pumps, and one of the ones I've talked about before is, or maybe not, you all, so we talked about how venous blood turns from the tissues back to the right side of the heart. Let me show you a picture. That's kind of what I'm getting to here. But so what is the force? So we know blood moves in one direction, but what is the force that pushes blood, for example, to my big toe and back to the heart? What force is allowing blood to move? Yes. So ventricular systole, right? Contraction of the left ventricle is the force that pushes blood out of the heart down to my feet, to my fingertips, to my head and scalp. That force is the same force that has to move that blood back from my big toe up to the heart, right? There's nothing in my big toe pumping or pushing blood. So the same force that pushes blood to my big toe is responsible for getting it back to the right side of my heart. But you can imagine the closer you are to the pump right here, the higher the pressure is here. The further you get away, the pressure is going to what? You all think about that. So wherever the pump is, the force is going to be higher closest to the pump. So blood leaving the heart is under higher pressure close to the heart. And the further you get away from the heart, the lesser the pressure is. So the blood getting to my big toe is not a big issue. The pressure is decent. But trying to get that blood back up from my feet to my heart is a challenge because you're far away from the what? The heart, the pump, the left ventricle. For that reason, we need help to get blood back up to the heart. So veins, we'll see that veins have valves. You don't see valves in arteries because the pressure within the arteries, remember, are what? Close to the heart. So the pressure is pretty high in the arteries, but that blood coming back to the heart, the pressure is very low. So what the valves do is when blood gets up to a certain point in the vein, those valves prevent the blood from falling back down to the feet. Okay, so it helps to make sure the blood doesn't go backward. Another thing that is necessary is the use of the muscles of the leg, the calf muscles. And what they do is when they contract, they squeeze the blood upward. And that's what we're seeing here. So when you're using your calf muscles, just walking, moving your legs, the muscles are helping to push the blood up, back up to the heart. Okay? So what you see then, that kind of helps explain why it's important for people who may be paralyzed, right? They can't move their legs. Any of you know anyone like that? And what has to be done with their legs all the time? Right, or even people who are bedridden in the hospital, there's something that's done to their legs. And this is why. If blood is not moving, remember it's not going to move if the muscles of the legs are not contracting. So if they can't contract their legs, the muscles of their leg, then blood just kind of sits there. And what happens when blood sits somewhere for a long time? It forms clots. So you see that a lot of times people who are paraplegic or quadriplegic, some of them die of a blood clot because the blood clot forms in their leg and then it travels to the heart, the brain, the lungs. So those are some concerns.
It's something like when I was in hospital and I couldn't move, they used to tell me to put things around my leg. It's kind of like a blood pressure cup.
Mm-hmm. Tight, squeeze, yeah, that's what it was. So that was to get your blood, keep your blood flowing so you don't form blood clots. And your parents don't sue the hospital for not taking care of that. Yeah, so that's how that works. Did I tell you all about one of my students who, her mother came over from Africa, and I think when she went back, she passed like a couple of days later from pulmonary embolism. And that's another concern, just like patients lying in the bed for a long time. You have to assist them by pumping the muscles of their legs. They say the same thing about people traveling overseas. Do not sit for the whole time. Maybe get up and walk around every hour. Some people just take, just sit there. Yeah, sleep. Right, and that's probably what I would be doing. But that can, again, cause blood clots to form in your legs because you're not contracting those muscles. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Some are probably, it occurs in some more often than others maybe. There may be some genetic disposition to that, but yeah, it can happen to anyone. All right, pause. Blood pressure. Okay, so again, blood pressure. So we have systolic pressure versus diastolic pressure. So you all know hopefully what blood pressure is by now. What is the difference between systolic pressure and diastolic pressure? Okay, with pressure. So that's what those two words mean. Diastole is relaxation and systole is contraction. But what is systolic pressure? Pressure exerted during ventricular contraction. You understand that? Or is it just something to memorize? Systolic pressure, pressure exerted during ventricular contraction. So there's always a certain amount of pressure, let's just say in the aorta. Let's just say we're measuring how much pressure there is in the aorta when the ventricles contract versus when the ventricles are relaxed. Think about that. So when the ventricles contract, what is going on in the aorta? So when the ventricles contract, what's happening? Well, first of all, what's happening in the ventricles? It's to the blood in the ventricles. So when the ventricles contract, that blood in the ventricles is being forced where?
Aorta.
Into the aorta. So what is the aorta doing? Not contracting. Contraction means expanding. So that blood is being forced into the aorta. So the walls of the aorta are stretched. And that means that the aorta at that time has a what? Higher pressure. When the ventricles are relaxed, the blood in the ventricles is staying in the ventricles, right? So there is no stretching of the aorta at that time. So if you compare the pressure when the ventricles are the pressure in the aorta when the ventricles contract versus when the ventricles relax, then you can see the difference. Okay, so the systolic pressure is the pressure exerted on the vessel wall when the ventricles are contracting. Okay, diastolic pressure is the pressure exerted on the wall of your aorta or any artery when the ventricles are what? Relaxed. Okay, so which number should be higher? Always, right? So normal blood pressure is 120/80 for an adult, a resting adult. And the 120 represents what? Your systolic pressure. This is one the nursing students say they get drilled on all the time. Explain it. You know, that's what they want you to do. Explain systolic pressure. So now you all can explain it as the pressure where? The aorta or any artery or blood vessel. When the ventricles are contracting. Okay? And then the diastolic pressure is the pressure where and when. Right. The pressure within the aorta and other arteries and vessels when the ventricles what? Are relaxed. So the way you all should remember this, and actually the norms, that's the norm. When does the blood pressure become considered hypertension? When blood pressure reaches what? So hypertension is, remember the blood pressure at rest, so we're talking about a resting adult, is 140/90. That's kind of the threshold. That's kind of the beginning of being too high. Okay? Stage 2, 160/100. The key, though, is to recognize the systolic and diastolic separately. And what I mean by that, so whenever the systolic pressure is 140 or higher, that's considered hypertension. Whenever the diastolic pressure is 90 or higher, that's considered hypertension. So on a test, I might ask, for example, let's see, someone has a blood pressure of 110/92. Is that hypertension? Yes. So they don't both have to be high to be considered hypertension. So you have to look at them separately. No, the systolic is fine, but anytime you have one of them too high, then that is considered hypertension. Okay, not a whole lot left there. Oh, yeah. Not too much of a fever. And this diagram just shows you the difference in pressure as you get further away from the pump. So remember we said the heart would be here to the left at the bottom left of the aorta. So blood in the aorta, the blood pressure of the aorta is high, 120. But the further you get away from the heart, what happens to the blood pressure? It gets lower and lower. So the blood pressure of the veins, the leg veins, remember, there's not a whole lot of force. So the veins need help getting the blood on back up to the heart. Okay. Yeah, that's about all I have here. Viscosity, have we talked about that before? Blood viscosity is just the thickness of blood, right? And I'm gonna go over some of the compensatory mechanisms. I went over these more in the early integrity session, so you all can go over that. Okay. Aneurysm, couple of things here that are problematic. So an aneurysm is a bulging sac in the blood vessel wall. So if you're looking at a blood vessel, sometimes the part of the blood vessel wall becomes weakened, and there's a bulge in the wall of the blood vessel. You may see that on some tires. There's just a bad part of the tire, and the pressure is what forces that weakened part out, causing the bulge. And this can occur in individuals who have hypertension, and you can imagine hypertension being increase in blood pressure, so the wall of the blood vessel is constantly being stretched. So some parts of the vessel wall can become weakened. So this is one of the consequences of hypertension. Swelling deranges other structures, so if there's a bulge here, whatever this blood vessel is sitting against may be damaged in some way. And then they can burst, and that can be fatal. One of the common sites of aneurysms, when they do occur, is the base of the brain. Remember, you all had the picture of the base of the brain, that circle of Willis. And so if that occurs, then that affects blood flow to the brain. And surgery can replace the damaged segments if it's not a vital blood vessel. Another common location for these aneurysms is the descending aorta, such as the abdominal aorta. Remember that? And with so if there is an aneurysm that actually bursts, the blood is leaking out of the vessel there. So you can imagine the aorta being another area where there will be a concern, because the aorta is under high pressure, right? So a lot of the blood being forced into the aorta is gushing right out. So the concern there obviously will be hemorrhaging too quickly, losing blood. Okay, so hemorrhage is profuse escape of blood from a broken blood vessel. And that can be internal or external, can be life-threatening. So why is hemorrhaging life-threatening? Because you're losing blood, right? And it's too much. So initially, the problem is a drop in the pressure. And that's kind of why I wanted to go over the slides before. But the body does a whole lot of things in compensation for a drop in blood pressure. So you can imagine if a person is losing blood because they're hemorrhaging, what is their blood pressure doing? It's dropping rapidly. And the problem with blood pressure being too low is what? Hmm?
Oxygen to the cells.
Right. So immediately, though, the problem is, like you said, the blood, if there's not enough, then it's not going to be much of a push. The heart will contract, but it's not enough force to push blood anywhere. Okay? So at some point, pressure can become too low. And what the body tries to do, and if you think of a person who's in a car accident, sometimes they'll say, oh, I'm okay, I'm feeling okay. But they're always told to go what? Get checked out in case. Okay? Because there could be some internal bleeding that they don't know about. Blood vessels inside the body can break and you not have pain, for example. But all of a sudden, your blood pressure starts to drop, and what the body then does is make sure the vital organs are getting their blood flow. So the body starts cutting off blood flow to those non-vital areas. So you feel fine. The brain is the main place that needs to get blood constantly. So at some point, though, you're going to run out of blood. Less blood is going to get to the brain, and that's when you'll pass out. So it's good to check that so they can possibly close off that leak so your blood pressure doesn't drop to a point where it can be fatal. Okay? So one of the things I think I mentioned before, one of the compensatory mechanisms for low blood pressure, you all should know that, as well as for high blood pressure. We talked about high blood pressure in the autonomic nervous system. So how does the body compensate when blood pressure is too high? Remember that? So what does the body do when blood pressure is too high? What does it try to do? Decrease blood pressure how? Remember, a signal goes from the baroreceptor. We do need to have that final, don't we? Comprehensive. Y'all forgot everything. We need to go back on that. Y'all better tell me about blood pressure. So the baroreceptor. So baroreceptors do what? Oh, Lord. Yeah, y'all need to go back over this again. First, tell me what baroreceptors are. They're stretch receptors. So what does that mean? Detect changes in pressure, which involves stretching of blood vessels. Ooh, y'all way out. So those blood vessels stretch. That activates the baroreceptors. The baroreceptors send a signal. You don't even have to be specific. Where does the signal go? Just in general, what part of the body? The medulla oblongata. But the brain is fine. If you just say a brain, it's just one. So then the brain makes the decision on how to correct it by lowering pressure. So a signal is sent from the brain to the heart. So the signal to the heart is telling the heart to slow down. Okay? So, yeah, so all these things you all are going to have to recall at some point. So here you have low blood pressure. So what we're talking about is homeostasis. How does the body maintain when pressure goes too high or too low? So we just talked about the baroreceptor overstretching sends a signal that the pressure is too high, lowering heart rate, and thereby lowering blood pressure. Hemorrhaging causes blood pressure to drop. There's not enough blood. So how do you think the body is responding to that? There's actually a few things that you all may not know, but from what you know, what do you think would be the signal? Similar to what we just talked about with high blood pressure. Signal goes baroreceptor to the brain, and now the brain makes a decision to do what? Send a signal to the heart, telling it to. If the,
It's too low.
it's already too low, so you want to speed it up, which makes it go higher. Okay, and that's another thing. A person who's in an accident, like I said, they're nervous, obviously, so you know their heart rate is up because they're probably really nervous. But another reason could be because they're in this state, their blood pressure is dropping, so their heart is beating fast, trying to recover the pressure. All right, and different types of shock. But the word shock, though, you should know just means inadequate blood flow to tissues. So if someone's blood pressure is too low, they're not getting enough blood flow to the tissue. The heart is not able to pump it effectively because there's not enough of it. Okay? So there are different types. One of the most common is hypovolemic. Hypovolemic. What does that word mean if you break it down? Low blood volume, right? So volemic is volume, and that's obviously referring to blood volume. And then hypo, not enough blood. A cardiogenic shock, if the heart is not pumping effectively, such as with heart failure. The heart is just not pumping. Remember we talked about there's left-sided heart failure, right-sided heart failure. What is the failure? The failure is what? That the heart is not able to what? Pump effectively. Pump as strongly as it should. Okay. All right.